outgoing president of the African Development Bank, Akinwumi Adesina, has disclosed that Nigeria has the highest population of people living without electricity globally. That's roughly 86 million Nigerians who lack access to electricity. Sadly, this has been our story for decades and has crippled businesses and industries nationwide, from rice millers up in the north being forced out of business to hospitals in the south who at times are unable to provide essential services due to epileptic power supply or high electricity tariffs. Our head of digital, Kathleen Udongmo, captures the situation in this report.
Nigeria, Africa's economic giant, has stumbled in the dark. The country's power supply has endured roughly 232 collapses in the last 14 years. Gas shortages, vandalism, fires, technical faults, and even deliberate power cuts, any of these can send Nigeria's grid into darkness. Nigeria's declining oil revenue in the 1980s prompted the government to consider restructuring its economy.
At first, people said that it was it was because it was called NEPA, and everybody was bundled inside one, and then it's too big, nobody can do it, and so we needed to privatize, and we privatized, and where are we? And they said, oh no, it's not that one. What the minister just said, that is privatization, is infrastructure deficit. We don't have enough generating plants, we don't have this, and so from the time of President Obasanjo, a lot of money was poured into the system. Where are we?
Privatization, including the National Electric Power Authority, NEPA, became a key focus. The Babangida administration sought World Bank assistance, which included privatization as a condition. These led to the 1988 Technical Committee on Privatization and Commercialization, the TCPC, highlighting the issue. Despite delays across multiple governments, the 1999 Public Enterprises Decree finally targeted NEPA for privatization. In 2013, President Goodluck Jonathan oversaw the transition of NEPA to the Power Holding Company of Nigeria, PHCN.
And so they now said, oh, well, maybe it's not that. The problem is the law. Because that there's an aspect of the Constitution that says that you cannot do anything if you don't come back. And then we said, okay, fine. And we amended the law. And then we have the Electricity Act 2023.
The infrastructure, just like the Honorable Minister spoke to earlier, of 1960, 63, 70, are still everywhere within our power system.
Nationwide blackouts are crippling the country. Despite skyrocketing energy bills and broken government promises, there's no end in sight.
A nation that has comparative advantage in gas finds it difficult to give gas to the power station, and we're all expecting El Dorado. Is not going to happen.
The real question is, will the government invest in a future where the lights stay on?
The oxygen of the power sector is cash, liquidity, no money, no power. It's just that simple.
There is no joy in seeing the people of this nation shoulder burdens that should have been shed years ago. I wish today's difficulties did not exist, but we must endure if we have to reach the good side of our future.
And endure we have. But will things change? And what is this current administration doing to ensure that there is a change, right? That's our focus on today's special. Who has access to power? How readily available is this power, and at what cost? We'll get into the details with our guest, the Special Advisor, Strategic Communications to the Minister of Power, Bolaji Tunji, after this break. All right, joining us now is the Special Advisor, Strategic Communications to the Minister of Power in person of Bolaji Tunji for this special. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good afternoon.
Yeah, let's begin on a congratulatory note, right? Obviously, sometime last month, well, for this administration so far, you know, we've been hitting historic highs when it comes to capacity generation. Sometime last month, we hit 6,003 megawatts, the highest in the nation's history. So what does that mean for the average Nigerian? And, you know, how have we been able to achieve that?
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to start with a quotation. You see, there's this American first lady that said, a good leader takes people to where they ought to go, and a great leader takes people to where they ought to be. Some hard decisions were made by this current administration, especially the Ministry of Power, in order to ensure that we get to this level where we are. Before the present administration got in, we were hovering around between less than 4,000 megawatts. The last time we had a celebration of a major issue like this was around 1984 when we had about 2,000 megawatts, and within that period to date, till this administration took over, we had about 4,000 megawatts. That's over 40 years to achieve 4,000 megawatts. But today, within less than 2 years of this administration, we have been able to do about 1,500.
What does that mean for us?
Yeah, what it means is that for the businesses and households in Nigeria, there will be more power available for them. You understand?
Okay.
And that is what people are experiencing now. You know, before now, it wasn't always like that. We had so many challenges, the economy had so many challenges, but today, these are gradually being reduced.
Right, gradually being reduced. And I remember when the story came out early last month, a couple of days after, well, you know, in one breath we're congratulating or somewhat celebrating, in the next breath there was the grid collapse. Just a couple of days after, the nation was plunged into darkness. So, I mean, that grid collapse. Last year we had 12 grid collapses or thereabouts. Now this year we're at 2. Should we be uncounting, or what is this administration doing to stop this?
Let me correct something. You see, what people believe is grid collapse. It's just what is called disturbance on the grid. It's not really.
Disturbance on the grid.
Disturbance on the grid.
What is disturbing the grid?
Well, there could be many factors. It could be through natural causes. I wouldn't say it's natural causes because when you have wind, serious rain affecting the towers, you know, or when there's a drop from in terms of generation, you know, it could affect the. But you see, when you have a grid collapse, actually, that means you won't be able to recover, bring back the light for people. Let me use this layman's language. But it's not. So we've never experienced that. We only have a little bit of disturbance on the grid, and within a few hours, it's always restored. So that's always the thing. But you see, when you look at between 2010 and 2024, we had the Nigeria experienced over 200 grid collapses. But now, with what the present administration has put in place, there's a serious reduction in the collapse of the grid. And why is this so? You see, there were some things that the government did. For example, last year, the government, let me just take it from the issue of the Siemens deal. The Siemens deal was part of the deals that was started by the previous administration under Buhari, which wasn't able to do much because of the COVID and everything, and then the death of the chief of staff there that was pushing it. But when the president signed this accelerated contract with the German company, that's Siemens, the idea was to help to ensure that we had upgrading of some of our infrastructure, you know, in terms of strengthening those infrastructure so that it will reduce the level of grid collapse. And I can tell you today that with what has been done, because the pilot phase of that deal has been completed, you know, we are at least 95%. Yes, yeah, and that one had about 10 substations and 10 power transformers, 10 mobile substations and 10 power transformers. This was just to strengthen the grid so that you can now ensure that the grid does not collapse.
So the pilot phase
has ended.
Are we going to consolidate that to prevent further
Of course, that's good. The second phase, which is the first phase, because that was a pilot phase which had about 10 mobile substations, 10 mobile substations and 10 power transformers in the country, which have been installed across the country to strengthen the grid and the infrastructure.
Okay.
Now this first phase now is going to go into, we are going to the first phase now. And the federal government has approved money for that, 262 billion or thereabout, to go into the first phase. And that is going to look at upgrading about 14-year substation will be upgraded. And then 21 new substations will be built. These are being done in order to ensure that the grid is strengthened so that this issue of grid collapse will be reduced.
Yes. I mean, that definitely needs to happen. We've seen a lot of investment. You've mentioned the Siemens deal. African Development Bank, I believe they invested about $200 million to strengthen the grid. And we've seen several investments in the sector over the years, right? During Obasanjo, $16 billion went in. This administration, I believe even last year, we secured a $500 million loan from World Bank. And the question people are asking, what has been done with that money in the past administration? Is there any level of accountability? And if we inject more money, what measures are we going to have to ensure that there's accountability and it's an investment, we get the returns on that investment?
Thank you very much. You see, one of the things that the President Minister did was to set up a monitoring team situated in the office so that any of these intervention loans that come in will be monitored in terms of how money is being spent, the level of the project that is being used, the money is being used for. So there's this unit there that the minister has established to monitor in his office. Apart from that, there's also the reporting structure that has been put in place by the minister to ensure that, at any point in time when any project is being done, there must be regular, periodic report about the level at which it is, So
but from what you're saying, there's a lot more accountability.
There's a lot more accountability right now with this present administration and with this present minister. He's an accountant, and they're always interested in the pennies. Accountability is very, very crucial for them.
And speaking of accountability, the debt situation in the sector has also been a huge issue. We have neighboring countries owing 55 billion naira, owing Nigeria 55 billion naira. We have the Gencos as well being owed 4.7 trillion from the government. So, every day, and we also have the everyday consumers also playing their part. So, what is being done in this regard as regards to debt? Because if you want to attract investment, they have to see that, there's no leakage, right?
Thank you very much. You see, the issue of debt has been a major factor in this sector. And has been the issue that has led to illiquidity in the sector. And because of this illiquidity in the sector, it has affected development in the sector. But all these things, like I said earlier, when some addition had to be taken by this minister, which was proposed, and that was what led to that tariff hike. We needed to do that, because if not, the way we were going, the sector was going to collapse. Because there was the subsidy. I remember in 2024, I think the budget then was 7.5 trillion. And out of that, the subsidy that was supposed to be paid that year was nearly about 10% of that budget. Electricity budget subsidy that was supposed to be paid was about 10%. And when you look at other things that are there in the country, other sectors that needed money, there was no way the government could have raised that kind of money. And it was affecting the sector, because you see the discos were not getting, the Gencos, that's those who are generating electricity, were not getting the money that was supposed to be given to them, because government was subsidizing electricity. Let's say electricity is about, let's just assume 200 naira, and government say, out of that 200 naira, the electricity is, we are going to pay 100, and then the 100, that's the subsidy. Unfortunately, this subsidy, I'm just giving that as an example. Unfortunately, the subsidy was not being backed with cash, and that led to a lot of huge debt. And it has this reverberating effect, because at the end of the day, you discover that the Gencos were not getting, for generating electricity, they were not getting the money we were supposed to get. And because we were not getting the money we were supposed to get, they could not pay the gas suppliers. And And,
So it's
when you look at generation in Nigeria, about 80% of generation is through thermal, which is gas powered.
Thermal, yeah.
80% of what we generate in this country is about is through thermal. While about 20% or thereabout is through hydro, that's water.
Right.
So if the gas suppliers are not supplying you gas, then it's going to ultimately affect the generation,
that
generation.
Subsidy removal, which has it been removed totally? Subsidy on electricity?
No. You see, subsidy has not been removed totally, but the government has been able to reduce
the subsidy.
The current administration and through the Ministry of Power and the tariff that was introduced, has been able to reduce the subsidies that government was supposed to pay through this tariff.
Right. Hopefully with these measures, we're able to see some sort of reform within the sector being taken and the loopholes and the leakages being blocked.
Oh, of course. Of course.
Thank you very much for that. It's been a pleasure having you on, the Special Advisor, Strategic Communication to the Minister of Power. He's still with us. We're going on a break and we have other members of the panel join us for this conversation. One of the first moves of the Bola Tinubu administration made within the power sector was the signing of the Electricity Act 2023, which was described as a game changer. Its intention is to decentralize the holding of power from the federal government, allowing states to generate, transmit, and distribute. States were expected to design their framework. And of course, we have a power-packed panel right now, pun intended, to break down the developments, over time. Right here we have the former Lagos State Commissioner for Energy and Power in person of Olalere Odushote. It's great to have you here.
Well, thank you for having me.
Right, we also have the CEO of Expedite Consulting and former Commissioner NERC Consumer Affairs, as well as Commissioner for Market and Competition Rate in person of Ayo Ekpo. It's great to have you, sir.
Thank you.
And with us is the principal partner and stakeholder of Eco Disco, as well with a strong legal, background and his own legal firm as well being run. We have with us George Etomi.
Thank you.
And staying with us, of course, is the SA to the Minister of Power in person of Bolaji Tunji. Let's begin, of course, with the Electricity Act. We're approaching 2 years since its signing. And I'm going to begin with you, Ayo Ekpo, right? 2 years, almost 2 years since its signing. What states would you say are ahead when it comes to building a policy framework around it and, making sure that that act sees through to the states as well?
Okay, so one has to be careful about ahead and behind because it's not a race. It's not a race. There are no prizes at all for whoever is the first to do anything.
Fair enough.
I'd rather speak in terms of those states that have held themselves out as almost like guinea pigs, right? Because it's an experiment. They haven't done this before. It's a transition. So people learn as they go out. They learn by doing effectively. And the states that have gone out ahead, not just to pass laws, but also to actually carry out the work of trying to transit. I might mention Oyo State, in no particular order.
Oyo State.
Oyo State, yes. Lagos State, of course.
And what would you say stands them out? So as
the fact that they have not just passed laws, but are also carrying out the actions of working with NERC, working internally to train people, to set up commissions, to actually set up the structures that enable markets to work within states. So Lagos, Akwa Ibom, Enugu, right, which was really the first to go out there.
Right.
And I would say Akwa Ibom, those 4 states. There are a number of others. Edo is another one that has taken steps. But I would say that these 4 or 5 are almost like the avatars, the foreigners, so to speak, of this very interesting transition that we are going through.
Yeah, interesting. I didn't hear you mention Abia State anywhere in there, and there has been a lot of. I'm going to come to George and tell me now on that. There has been a lot of attention within the state and how it's managing the power situation. What's your assessment, and what would you say is standing Abia State out when it comes to the power sector?
Again, I want to again you to avoid the word standing out.
Fair
but
enough.
Abia State, yes, has taken definitive steps. They've passed the law. They've set up the regulatory commission, and what perhaps stands them out is the presence of geometric energy, because that was already in place, and it was to serve a captive market, the Abia industrial cluster. With that model, which allowed them to generate, transmit, and distribute power, you already have an idea of what a disaggregated market would look like. So that's what perhaps stands Abia out. But the jury is still out as to how a full integration will take place, because Abia geometric operates within the territory of Enugu Disco, and for quite a while they were in court trying to sort out these niggly issues that we're talking about. So hopefully, with the state government now playing a major role in regulation, they'll be able to bring the stakeholders together to create a seamless industry, because what we require in this industry is collaboration. Because it's uncharted waters, so we need all the collaborations that we can.
Okay, I mean, hopefully we see that happen. But I'm going to come to you now, Lalere, and obviously you were, I mean, Lagos is considered the benchmark state, and I know they said we shouldn't use standouts or make it a competition, but Lagos is considered the benchmark state. If they get it right, there's a tendency that others as well will follow suit, and perhaps we'll also see that collaboration. You were a part of the policy making, right? So when you were in office at the time. So what's your assessment of how it has gone since then? And obviously, I believe there's a full transition that's expected to happen by June this year. What needs to be done? What's the method to it to make sure that some of the issues that perhaps were had on the federal level do not come down or are not transferred to the states?
One of the things we know about Lagos is that it's been called a victim of its own success. And I'll tell you why I say that. Lagos sits on less than 0.4% of Nigeria's landmass and plays host to between 12 and 13% of all Nigerians, meaning Lagos is at a critical point where it needs to solve certain problems. And that's why Lagos typically takes the first step, because not because they necessarily or politically want to, it's almost because they are forced to do it. And so every Lagos state governor comes to the office and suddenly finds out that there's a lot that they have to achieve. And so it's not like the federal government that is in Abuja and is far removed from the people. Lagos State is very close to the people of Lagos and has to account to the people of Lagos for everything it does. So one of the things we found out during the campaign in a couple of years ago was when we asked people what their biggest problems were. The first problem was traffic. The second problem, they said, was electricity. And so that made it clear that the government had, at that time, its work charted out for it. And what the government very quickly found out was while they could intervene in traffic, there was very little they could do with electricity. And so one of the charges from the governor was, what can we do to solve that problem? It's basically to shift the responsibility of managing the electricity infrastructure from the federal government to the state, so the state can at least make an attempt to do something about it. And Lagos State didn't do it on its own. It spoke to the other states, to the Governors Forum, to get their buy-in into this devolution that was intended in the Constitution anyway, except for some typos that made it impossible for the states to carry out their functions. So again, to your question, the states cannot afford to do what the federal government is doing, because the people are going to be asking them about what the solutions are.
Most definitely. Thank you for that. And I'm going to have to come to the federal, right? And I have in my head the picture of a parents letting their child, come of age and take control of, their states or their lives. As the, so to say, parent, in quotes, what role is the federal government playing for that smoother transition, and what role will it play ahead, if at all?
Yeah, thank you very much. You see, prior to the signing of the Electricity Act of 2023, we had a lot of certainty in terms of framework policies, and with the signing, the rules seems to be more clearer for everybody. And apart from that, it has been able to open up the sector for the participation of the states, which it's been elaborated on here. And basically, the federal government is there to ensure that all these policies that are there, they guide the states in terms of all the policies that are being put in place, and they follow up with whatever has to be done. Like I said earlier, it's something that we are going to be learning as we move along, because it's not something that we had done before.
Indeed.
But with time, we get there. But the idea is to give electricity to Nigerians. And in order to do that, certain things had to be done. And one of those things that had to be done was the issue of this Electricity Act, which has given us a framework that has to be followed to ensure that.
If I can just add to that. So you have the Electricity Act that has a provision in this section 230, that subsection 2. So I don't want to be too legalistic here. There's a provision in the Act that sets out the process of transition that happens between the states and the and NERC, so to say, the federal government.
Right.
When a state has done certain basic things like pass a law, set out a policy, actually set up, its regulatory body, it then notifies the federal government, particularly NERC, and NERC then starts the process of a transition. That is a critical stage. And one thing we've found, working with a number of states, I work with the United Kingdom Nigeria Infrastructure Advisory Facility. We work with Akwa Ibom, Oyo, and Enugu states. And what we found is that it's really ideal not to be in a hurry to give that notice to the federal government, because once you get that responsibility in your hands, it's almost like a hot potato. So you've got to prepare. The transition process is not one that you just trigger by itself. You get to engage with NERC, find out what's going on in your state from an electricity standpoint, what the responsibilities that are coming will be like, and then prepare yourself. So we're not just passing the law, but actually having the people, the human capacity that is required to actually carry out policy and regulatory activity.
And it's interesting you say it shouldn't be rushed, right? But we know, and you've emphasized the need for there not to be a race. But we know that Lagos State, I believe now is, or there's some sort of deadline for June. Do you see the states being ripe to meet that deadline for transition?
Well, look, you never do everything that you need to do, but you'll be prepared to some degree. And the important thing is actually to carry out that interaction, that engagement with your counterparts, not just NERC. There's TCN, there's the DISCO that operates within your state, there's NAPTIN, there are all sorts of federal government power sector agencies that you've got to work with and actually try to understand what they do that concerns your state, which you will now, as a state regulator, as a state ministry of power, take direct responsibility for. So that preparatory phase is critical. And what you have in Lagos is that Lagos has given notification to the federal government, to NERC, and so the clock begins to run. And 6 months from the time when that notification is delivered, whether you want it or not, whether you are ready or not, the responsibility passes over to you. Which is why I say that before you give that notice, there's a bit of preparatory work that you need to do, and we're finding that out. Which is why, it's not, the race is not always to the swift. It ends up being the race ends up being to those who are better prepared and thorough in their preparation. That's what you learn from these states that have gone out ahead: Akwa Ibom, Enugu, Oyo, Lagos, and the rest of them.
Can I just add that with Lagos State, on the practical side of things.
I was going to come to you next, yes.
The two DISCOs that serve Lagos State, Eco and Ikeja, have already set up sub-cos to take over the assets with which the regulator in Lagos State will be dealing with. So that's one step that's been taken. Lagos itself has set up a very able, solid regulatory body, I can tell you for free, made up of experts, because let's not forget where this whole thing is coming from, and that is that there's a liquidity crisis in the entire value chain. So it is that state who, through law and regulation, that can attract investments that will win this race. Because what all these portend is that states will perhaps begin to grow at their own pace. So if a state decides, I'll give priority and give all the instruments it can to encourage investors to come in, to generate, transmit, and distribute electricity as a means of, let me say, igniting development in the state, then they would have understood why this entire transition from federal to state will work. But having said that, no hurry, because you need to look at those practical transitional issues. You have to delineate assets, There are some discos that cover 4 states.
Right.
So you have to properly delineate those assets. And I quickly just advise that states should be careful not to become toll gates. Because the tendency is to say, I want my own regulation, and then you are taxing everybody that comes. Because once you do that, then you will scare investors away. So they have to be very careful alignment of what this regulation will all mean to attracting investment to your state. So again, I go back to Lagos State. Long before the Electricity Act was passed, Lagos State actually engaged with both Ikeja and Ekro Discos. I attended some of those practical meetings. They were friendly. Larry's here. They were very friendly, and they were practical. How do we make it work for Lagos State? Lagos State alone can consume, without batting an eyelid, what we produce totally in Nigeria, without batting an eyelid. So what do we do? For example, since the passing of the law, I know they're talking about how they can they've set up a company that can generate up to 4,000 megawatts. And that would be for Lagos. How you then deploy it is a different ballgame. They have to look at other sources of energy as well, renewables, solar, all the complements.
That's a lot of investment,
yes,
right,
yes.
that needs to be made.
That is the key thing. So you have to ensure that investors are attracted. And I say this to you because people very often misunderstand, oh, discos were bought by people who didn't have the money, didn't do this. No, the circumstances under which they bought, the conditions were not met. And no investor brings in money to subsidize an industry.
Right,
They bring in money, and they will need to do what they need to do.
And that, of course, led to the tariffing system, which we are going to get to in just a moment. But let me come to you. You've heard what has been said so far about, how things need to be done thoroughly and properly, and the need for investments. When it comes to being ripe for that investment, what are some of the loopholes that needs to be plugged? He has highlighted the electricity subsidy that has been going on. Are there other loopholes as well that need to be plugged to make sure there are no leakages and those investors can come through and be held properly?
All right, let's take a step back very quickly. Electricity is a business. That's how it's run everywhere, right? Even in Nigeria, we agree that it's a business. The problem we have is when you look at a business and then you say, this business is not able to charge cost-reflective tariffs because we do not want them to charge cost-reflective tariffs. We then tell them, all right, here's how much we want you to charge in tariffs. Basically holding that business back and say, we will make up the difference for you. And then we don't make up the difference. You've basically said to everybody, don't bother going to invest in that sector. And those are the issues. That's the biggest issue. Because at the end of the day, everybody will do what they need to do in order to make business, in order to make money or to turn their business into a profit-making entity. As long as the federal government or the state government in turn does all that it's required to do, which is to put a framework in place, right? In my opinion, if you want to create inefficiencies in any sector or in any industry, introduce a subsidy. And as soon as you do that and you don't properly determine where that subsidy is going to be and how they're going to approach that subsidy, then you've basically created an industry that's going to implode and die.
Right.
Because everybody, rather than buy and sell electricity or buy and sell a good, will simply turn themselves into companies that are adept at applying for subsidies.
And I mean, we've seen this administration across different sectors undo the subsidy era pretty much, FX, power sector, and others.
Just to add some context to that, does the electricity sector need to be subsidized? That's a question that people like to ask a lot. Then you ask yourself, what exactly is the electricity sector in Nigeria? Yeah, they're going to tell you that Lagos gets 1,200 megawatts from the grid, and Lagos runs on 1,200 megawatts. Yet Lagos is supposedly the 9th largest economy in Africa. You hear that a lot from everybody saying that. But there's a problem with that, right? When you look at the GDP of a country and you plot it against the energy that's consumed, there's a correlation. There's basically a regression line that you can draw across it. And so when you position Lagos as the 9th largest economy, and then you draw that regression and say how much power should Lagos be consuming, it's above 1,200 megawatts. And so one of the things I did at that time was to say, let's go and count where the additional power is coming from. If I told you to guess, you'd probably get it wrong. We have 19,200 megawatts of diesel generating capacity in Lagos. That is making up the difference between the power that's supplied by the grid and the power that's consumed to make Lagos the 9th largest economy in Africa. So when you look at that and then you say 1.2 megawatts versus 1.2 gigawatts supplied by the grid versus 9.2 capacity that exists, even if you discount that capacity significantly, you're still going to come up with a number of about 5,500 megawatts that's generated on the side. So 20% of the energy that Lagos generates comes from the grid. More than 80% comes from own generation, which is terribly expensive. And then you ask yourself, are we really subsidizing electricity consumption in Lagos? We are not. Okay. We really are not, because again, generating from diesel or solar is significantly more expensive.
So that comes to the question around pricing, and I think we'll get to that ahead, right? Pricing electricity, especially for the consumers. But before we go on a break, I'm going to come to you, Ekpo, and it's focusing on the disco level, right? They have direct contact to the consumers. There is that tug, right? And the federal government is putting pressure on the discos. We need you to be profitable so that you can attract investment. And then we have the consumers saying that the pressure is too much on us. You're just focusing on, being profitable and not necessarily service delivery. How do we have that balance that discos are profitable, but then consumers are not overburdened with exorbitant tariffs?
I think the additional point I'll add to Larry and try to answer your question is that I believe governments have got it wrong consistently in thinking that they need to give people electricity. That thinking is now unwinding itself necessarily just because of the financial straits in which we find ourselves. We're becoming a lot more realistic. As Larry said, it's a business. And the consumer is not a fool. The consumer understands the economics of having to provide anything. The challenge that we've had, I discovered when I was a commissioner in NERC, was not about the pricing. It was about the reliability of supply, less the affordability and more the consistency and the availability of that supply. So the consumer understands the logic of having to pay the right price for a particular product or service, understands that very well. We're a nation of traders, right? This country, we're a nation of entrepreneurs. You don't need to explain to us why I need a little bit more above the cost of a particular item so I can come back to buy it tomorrow. The challenge is not with the pricing, it's with the availability. So we don't want to pay the right price for electricity and in addition pay for diesel generation.
Right.
It doesn't make sense. Right? And that's where the pushback and the resistance to tariffs and tariff increases comes from. The moment you have distribution companies being able to assure the consumer of a more consistent, a steadier supply, you will see that there's acceptability of tariffs. We increased tariffs on January 1st, 2015 by about, I think it was about 60-70%, if I remember correctly. And there wasn't any outcry. Because for the previous 4 months, we had worked with industry to ensure that supply in Nigeria was a lot more consistent. And in fact, I still have the newspaper cuttings from future writers in newspapers saying, is it time for us to throw away our generators? Because supply was a lot more consistent. So when we went up with tariffs on January 1st, 2015, 3 months before an election, there wasn't so much of a problem at all about that tariff increase.
Right.
So it speaks to the fact that the consumer actually understands the economics of energy supply and has no problem with the tariff increase, because no matter what it is you pay for grid energy, it will always be orders of magnitude cheaper than self-generation.
All right. I mean, we'll speak more to the tariff system after this break, but of course you have quite some, and I guess that's what you've shared with us as the former Commissioner, Consumer Affairs and for Markets and Competition at some point with the NERC. It's still power and the people. We are talking accessibility, affordability, and availability here on News Central. Stay with us. We'll be back after this break. All right, we're still on topic, talking power and the people. Sometime last year, we had the introduction of the tariffing system, and it would be interesting to get into that and how pricing has affected different sectors as well. We have, of course, Bolaji Tunji with us, and obviously from the top, What's your assessment of how this tariffing system has played out, especially with some consumers saying that, oh, you know, it's sort of some sort of discrimination or segregation. We had that agitation initially when the tariffing system was announced. So what's your assessment along the line?
Yeah, thank you very much. Before talking about the implication of the tariff increase, we need to look at where we are actually coming from. Prior to the issue of the tariff being increased, you know, we had a lot of problems in the industry in terms of huge debt that came from the legacy debt that was, you know, met on ground by the administration that is on ground now, and then the subsidy that we're speaking about here. You know, we had about, I think, 2.9 trillion, no, billion. Yeah, no, 2.9 billion of legacy debt and 1.9 billion of subsidy from subsidy. That's about 4 billion. Yeah, 4 billion or thereabout, if I'm right. No, sorry, trillion. It's trillion. Trillion. Yeah, trillion. Yeah. So you see that had impacted negatively on the industry, in the sector, in terms of, okay, now the generating companies, you had to pay them. The generating company had to pay the gas companies, and because of that, because the subsidy was not being backed by cash, it was a major problem for the sector, and we experienced certain problems around I think December 2023, January, February 2024, when we had this blackout. And what caused that blackout? It was because the gas company was saying, look, there's so much indebtedness. We needed to survive. We needed to be paid because they were the ones supplying. As I said earlier, 80% of our generation is from gas, is thermal, from gas supply, you know. And because of that, because there was problem with supply of gas, it was very difficult for them to...
So this was the only way out.
Now, in order to ensure that we solve this problem, to solve the burden of subsidy on the top of part of government, we needed to do a little bit of tweaking of the tariff, and that what led to this band aid. If not, it would have been a major problem in the industry for the industry to actually survive. And it was just to reduce the subsidy burden on the government. That was what led to this issue of...
So your assessment, you know, of this as a solution, and of course we've heard Nigerians say, you know, they don't have a problem paying for power as long as, you know, there are guarantees that power will be available. So what's your assessment of this methodology, the band A, band B, and C and C?
You see, let me put things in perspective. Right. When the privatization took place, there were key promises made as part of the attraction for investors. We'll give you cost-reflective tariffs, we'll ensure you get 5,000 megawatts, we'll pay off the MDA debts, and we'll give you debt-free books.
Right.
I mean, and I'm saying this because states who are stepping into the shoes of the federal government should learn from what has gone past. Not many of these promises were kept. And in fact, as we still speak today, we're still generating around about 5,000 megawatts. How many years after? So, and then there's also there's a political question too with tariffs. Eyo mentioned that there was a tariff increase, but he didn't mention that it was reversed because of the elections. And from that point on, there was a problem. NEC was doing its duty. They were doing their regular 6-month whatever activities. We were going for the meetings. So we all had an idea of where the tariffs should be, but it never happened. And then boom, comes COVID. Government too, no money coming from anywhere, and then there was that sudden increase in tariffs. And what did it create? A tariff shock. And once it created a tariff shock, the experience we had was that consumers bypassed their meters. And I'm not exonerating the discourse. There are some funny guys amongst them who would encourage that. And energy theft is one of the biggest issues we have today. So you just need to manage these things very well. So fast forward. Band A, Band C, Band D, it's a government's way of trying to see how they don't upset the general populace, and then how they can share this subsidy burden with those who can afford it.
Right.
So they came up with these. Band A will give you 20 hours. But whatever you need to do, if the supply is not there, what would you do? So people have gone on to Band A, they're paying 4 times what they were paying before, but they're not seeing electricity. That's the complaint we have every day. So again, for states who want to go into this, you must concentrate on ensuring that there's availability. The technical issue of transmission, I don't know how they're going to disaggregate the national grid, but let's begin to see how within the states you can look for off-grid solutions. And it's very, very key. Embedded generation, so many of these different off-grid. Then I come back to the rural thing. There are lots of rural dwellers who are not looking for ACs or whatever. They just want to power their homes, watch their football, and do whatever they need to do. Now, we have a client who is doing battery as a service. And all they do is they just get solar-powered batteries, and which are rented out, some for as low as 4K a month. And that's making many people happy. So if, again, there is consistency around many of these states, if they do that, they can take quite a lot of segments from the grid. And then you now begin to look for power for those who can actually regenerate your economy. And those are your industrial consumers, your service providers. Those are the ones who will pay. We don't have the time, but if I give you the breakdown of revenue, you'd see that the bulk of the people from which it's coming from are not being served. So they are paying your electricity tariff, but they're also paying for diesel, and they're paying for solar. And by the way, let's be careful. If we continue putting pressure on these well-to-do Nigerians, they'll go off-grid themselves. And many I know have gone off-grid. So the revenue you may be expecting from this inefficient banding might not come.
Right.
So we've got to sort of work these things out very carefully.
Right. And let's come to the potential, with off-grid solutions and on a state-by-state level. Let us a bit into that and how perhaps that should be done systemically.
It's an interesting question. I think I said before that it's already happening. It's not something that is going to be legislated. I'll give you an interesting anecdote. So for a period of 10 years, if you can call it that, for a period of 3 years, Nigerians imported 24,000 megawatts of diesel generators over a 3-year period. Over a 10-year period, the grid was able to add 450 megawatts to its generation capacity. And I'm talking about capacity, I'm not talking about power that's going to the consumer. Just additional capacity. They were able to attract an investment of that. When Nigerians on their own, over a 3-year period, acquired 24,000 megawatts. So is off-grid currently happening? Yes, it is. Was it constrained by regulation to expand? Yes, it was. Because the question then becomes, if each one of us buys our own diesel generator, can we club together as an area and buy generators and basically enjoy economies of scale? The answer was no, because the regulator preferred the grid to continue to supply power to the people in that way. And the question is, what are the states going to do about that? They're certainly going to have to think about it differently because they don't have the capacity to provide the sorts of subsidies that the federal government was able to provide. So that encouragement of off-grid activities must happen, and the regulators within the state must understand that they cannot become, as he said, a roadblock or a bottleneck, because then they're going to be affecting the successes of the state, which is not what they were put there to do. Now, a lot of people don't understand when we say we wanted devolution of powers from the federal government to the state government. We weren't interested in control, in taking over control from the federal government. We were interested in opening up access and ensuring that there was additional power that was generated. We were going to enable it by putting a framework in place to ensure that there's more power coming in. We're not going to stay there and say we're controlling the sector, and therefore, because we're now in charge, we're going to impose penalties and fees and charges that are basically our entitlement, right? Which is the wrong way to look at it. So if you look at the development of the states, and like Ayo mentioned, we're currently doing some work with UK NIAF. The advice to the states is always to, first of all, look at how you can encourage investment before thinking about what the IGR potential is, or shifting from the federal government and saying what are the further opportunities, or even saying we're not investing in infrastructure, but we're going to look at the monies that's coming into that into the network. That's not what you should be looking at. It's really thinking about how you can improve the power supply, whether it's through the grid, which we believe if we unitize the infrastructure is the cheapest way to do it, or if we decide that we're going to look at it on a neighborhood by neighborhood basis,
we're
it
looking
might
for
be
the
an
more
off-grid
efficient
solution.
way to do it, whatever.
So the truth is they are both efficient, right? At some point, you start from if an area is isolated and it's going to cost too much to connect them to the grid, let's look at a mini grid in that area. That makes sense, and we can do that faster. We can do that within a couple of months rather than a grid extension, which might take a couple of years. So let's do that first. And as it grows bigger, we interconnect it with the grid, which then brings the price down significantly.
Right.
So those are the kinds of things that we need to start looking at. It's a hybrid solution. It's not a one-size-fits-all.
And I'm sure consumers are thinking...
Let me just add to that, just to advise consumers as well, because you must look at what your aggregate consumption is, what it costs you to give yourself power. So if you calculate your diesel cost, your solar, your grid cost, whatever that cost is, you want to make sure it comes down. So whether you're getting off-grid solution for it or you are getting a blend from the grid and off-grid, that's what you should be looking at. Because consumers it's funny how consumers are willing to pay for diesel at any cost.
As long as they have the power, right? They
quarrel when there is a tariff increase. And they go belly up, no way.
One is more reliable than the other? Is that the situation?
It's chicken and egg. If I get the right tariffs, I can actually, it's bankable. I can go make the investments to give you right power.
All right.
But when you're saying no, how do I start?
It's
interesting.
It's about trust, though. It's about trust.
It's about
confidence.
Trust increases have happened over and over, and there's been no improvement in reliability. I think that's what...
I think I'll come to ECHO now, with this and the off-grid solutions and, the confidence of consumers as well being boosted somewhat. And I'm also, while you draw that picture, I'm also going to chip in. We've heard the pricing part of it. We've heard a former minister say that, the price of electricity in Nigeria is ridiculously cheap compared to other African countries. And then there are other people on the other side of the argument saying that we're rich in gas. We have all the resources. Why should we be paying such a premium? So what's the balance here?
Well, so there's very little to be gained from looking at what goes on outside. Because what goes on outside is not what goes on inside here. Very different. You can think of any hotel chain that we have in Nigeria. There are a few of them that you can mention. They have different properties in different cities. Some even have different properties in the same city. But if you go into those hotels, you won't see that they're charging you the same room rates. Right? It's as basic as that. Why? They don't have the same number of people working in them. They didn't spend the same amount of money building each property. They don't have the same costs. If you earn a tariff that returns your costs, then of course you can only look at costs in a silo for a particular company. They don't usually end up being the same from one disco to the other, from one hotel property to the other. That's why you have different tariffs for different distribution companies, different tariffs even within the same geographical state, right, for different localities. That's what you should have, because tariffs follow costs. Right?
Should follow, yeah.
They should follow costs. So really, that's the basic principle. I can understand us having the same Band 8 tariff in Sokoto and in Lagos as a kind of like a feed-in measure, right? But it's not something that should be embedded over time, right? As if it's something that introduces the idea of leading up to different discos having to pay customers having to pay cost-effective tariffs, that's fine for a short while, But you can't say that you are having a regulated market and everybody in the country, regardless of what it costs to serve them, is paying the same tariff. There's something incongruous. There's something wrong about that.
Yeah, and I'm interested in getting your perspective, on this, right? Different solutions, right? Off-grid solutions that would reduce the burden on the national grid. Do you see this as well, perhaps leading to less frequent collapses? Or, how are you receiving this?
My take about this is that, you see, we have identified the fact that we've had some problems in the electricity sector in the past. And that resulted from all the experience, blackouts, Unfortunately, in order to tackle some of these problems, there are certain decisions had to be taken. It will be hard to some people. People listen to it, who are at the end of the day bearing the brunt of it. But this decision had to be taken. They are tough decisions. Look, do we need to continue with the situation we were before? We cannot, because it will lead to a collapse of the system, the sector. Do we leave it as a subsidized sector? It's not possible, because it has over the period of time, we've seen that there's no way the government can continue to provide that subsidy. And the issue of the banding thing was just to reduce the body of that subsidy on the government. We know that some of these people that are on banding, about 15% of the consumers, they are people that normally, would buy diesel to power their homes. They install other things to ensure they have electricity. Now, if you are not giving to them at a cheaper rate, 209 or thereabout, I think it's better for them. So I like he said, I think that's a subject of discussion about whether the tariff cannot continue like that. I'm sure, but the fact is that there must be people must pay for what they are consuming in order to ensure that the industry survives.
Yeah, and I'm sure those on other bands, just to bring that up, that you made reference to, other bands are wondering what becomes of us, right? Well, Band A, they're the only ones perhaps positioned to get all the power. What becomes of...
It's also about upgrading infrastructure by some of the discos, and once they start upgrading the infrastructure, I'm sure it's going to be able to talk about that. You cannot bring in people to Band A to give them about 20 hours of electricity. The thing is that, like it was mentioned here, Nigerians will pay when they are getting the service. If you are giving them 20 hours, if you say you are going to tweak the tariff a bit, they are going to pay for it. And those are the things we are looking at, the government is looking at that. Look, let's ensure that we make sure that we give people electricity, and you see that there's been a lot of progress that has been made, Like we earlier mentioned, we had about 6,003 megawatts produced, which is historical. And I'm sure that with what is being put in place presently, the Siemens deal, to strengthen the grid, to ensure that it doesn't collapse, we are still going to have a lot of people benefiting from what the government is doing now.
I'll come to you now, and obviously to respond to what he said, but also to speak to, as a stakeholder in EcoDisco, also to speak to the issues around energy loss due to poor workmanship and the skill gap, right? There are those who are saying that there's a significant amount of energy that's being lost because the personnel in the discos are not well equipped, right? There's that skill gap. So what's being done to address that?
Okay, before I address the skill gap, let me take on this point about trust. Trust. It's important because trust is the foundation of the relationship between the utility company and the consumer. And I believe that a robust metering system will bridge that gap. I hope we don't forget that metering is one of the biggest complaints we have from consumers. What we require for metering is far more in terms of cash than we can generate. And it's also a moving target because we add new consumers to the network as time goes on. So we need to look at how we can make the metering system a lot easier. Then, of course, we come to the...
And there have been so many initiatives with this metering. I mean, right now there's a presidential metering initiative.
Yeah, it all addresses the liquidity crisis, because ordinarily you would have expected that the utility company would have been responsible for the metering. But without cost-reflective tariffs, that's a burden they were not willing
to finance.
So the government has come up with a lot of mishmash. We will get there. But it's just so, again, because we're talking about states. States must ensure that they learn from Big Brother, federal, and see how they can ensure that those things that cause mistrust between the consumer and the utility company is as bridged as practically as possible. Now to the very practical and worrying issue you talked about, not having capable technical hands. It's a mix of what we're seeing in the economy generally. It's not as if discos haven't trained. I know EcoDisco, we took on about 500 young engineers, but we've lost about 75% of that to the Jackpot syndrome. Yeah, and that's again because for a mixture of reasons. So we now have the old hands, very reliable. I won't be uncharitable with those people you call the NEPA workers because they actually have loads and loads of skill. But they're aging. They're aging. And So again, we must create the incentive to attract younger ones.
And that incentive involves financing again, is that what
it involves financing, but if it's financing with a purpose, you know that ultimately I'm going to benefit from it, then the new disco owners will do it. And by the way, talking about ownership, a lot of the disco owners who started this business are no longer here. We just need to understand that at least 6 or 7 of those discos have changed hands. Although in many of the cases, it was forced on them. But there's one particular one, what EcoDisco is now doing is a first market-driven acquisition. And it's a model we should look at. For all the imperfections we've talked about, ECO has actually stood out in terms of its ability to grapple with problems given all the constraints that we're talking about. So it's an attractive proposition for investors. And we're seeing investors who are coming in. It's a trajectory we must keep so that states who want to attract investors can learn from that trajectory. Market-driven acquisitions will always ensure you get the right mix of money and talent.
Right.
In the core, we're getting, he talked about problem with availability of power. We have a mix of hydropower. Yeah. We have thermal. Yeah. And then we have the deep pockets. So what they will now invest in is know-how, which we're talking about.
Technical know-how.
So yes, so once you have that sort of thing and people are looking at, okay, this makes a business proposition. You see, to give an idea of how attractive this business can be, as a rule of thumb, your measure of development is tied to the amount of power that you have. South Africa generates 45,000 megawatts for a 55 million population roundabout. Right. And then you have all those sort of indices all over the place. But in Nigeria, we are grappling with 5,000 to 6,000 for a population of 200 million plus. If you're a positive thinker, you will see an opportunity there. There's a huge opportunity there. So people should not be discouraged by all the hiccups we're discussing, and it is good. I'm an incurable optimist because when I look at our journey from the banking industry to telecoms to where we are, I know Nigerians can turn the economy around. And that's why I don't want people to give up. The only thing I wished was that the power reforms should have preceded banking and telecoms.
Because that powers the economy,
everything. But there are capable hands, and we turn this economy.
Hopefully, we see it get done. As we tie things together, we want to take a look at projections ahead, and some of the things in the pipeline. Something that has come to the fore, and I think sometime in November last year, we had the rural electrification. You said I shouldn't call it agency.
No, agency is fine.
Agency. Oh, yeah. Agency. I mean, they have disclosed that it's starting a new rural electricity project financed by the World Bank, $750 million to provide electricity to 17.5 million Nigerians. And there are a lot of other deals as well in the work. I believe most recently we had Oando Clean Energy on building solar assembly plants. So what's your assessment of how this is building up and solving the problem of accessibility?
Every little helps is really what I would say to that. Anybody who's coming to invest in the sector because they believe that the regulatory framework is right is showing the way to other people. Because if the framework was not right, nobody would bring the investment. Anybody who wants to invest comes to the investment table understanding that they're going to get a return on their investment as well as a return off their primary investment. If that's what the framework is bringing up, then we should clap for it. The World Bank has been very supportive and has been very interested in this rural electrification game. I remember they came to the states at the time to say, can they work through the states for the first time, because they typically work with sovereigns. And because the states at that time weren't ready, none of them had any laws or regulatory bodies in place, and neither did they have any financial intermediaries that they could work through with the World Bank. They went to the rural electrification agencies level, which is fine as well because the money stays in Nigeria. It could have gone elsewhere if ARIA was not ready for it. So yes, we welcome it. Somebody asked me once if I wanted to invest in the power sector, which sector should I invest in? They said that there are some power plants that are available for sale by the BP. Should I be looking at that? And we had a good laugh about it, because the question is, do you want to invest where you do not see line of sight to your cash flows? No, you don't. So what are you looking at investing in? Any area where you can see the customer directly, sign a contract with them, and get your cash out is what you would invest in. And any area that's transparent enough for you to see line of sight to the cash flow is what you're interested in. And that's why the conversation with the regulatory commissions across all the states is to understand that there's a requirement from investors for them to come into your market. And if you don't meet those requirements, you'll be sitting down regulating empty space. And that's really all I'll say about that.
I mean, interesting, and enough said about that. But I'll still come to Ayo Ekpo on that. But let's shift a bit to the recent proposed ban on solar panel imports. Do we have a line of production to fill that gap? And generally, have we been able to solve, those issues by banning imports, right? In the past?
I think that the answer to the question has been taken out of our hands by Mr. Donald Trump. He simply forced every country to look more inwards.
Right.
And it's not just America alone that can drive production into America. We can do the same thing. So from that standpoint, I think it's a good thing. But even if Trump hadn't done what he's doing now, Larry mentioned something which we should pay attention to. If you count, the amount of energy in Lagos is not the 1,000 odd that comes from the grid. It's the multiples, 19, 20, 21,000, that is in people's homes, right? All distillate driven, diesel, petrol, right? Expensive. And so you want to look at the most, which means there is a demand. Because if there wasn't demand, we wouldn't buy this generator. So there's a demand. But you've got to make, and this is the trick about electricity in Nigeria, it's not about people who are not there. It's about people who are there and are providing for themselves in a very expensive manner. So how do you bring that cost down? It's renewables, right? It's things that are cheaper. So small hydro, solar, homes, and larger for businesses, right? So that demand is there. Why shouldn't we then meet that demand with Nigerian production, with Nigerian manufacture? That's my question. I think that's the question that those people that you mentioned, the Ohandos, I know that the federal government through Murphy is also investing, through the Infraco is also investing in the same thing. And I think the more of that, the better, because the market is actually there for us to address domestically with our own domestic production.
Okay, but I'll come to you now on that. The capacity to meet that need, right? Because if you're blocking from coming in, you have to be able to meet the demand locally. Do you see that capacity there now? It still needs to be built. What are your thoughts on this?
I don't know what's advising that sort of blanket ban without.
I don't think there's been a ban yet.
I don't think
there's no ban. I think we should focus on what is to be produced.
Yeah. So what my advice would be as much of the energy mix as we can get, provided they're efficiently deployed. Like I said, rural electrification should be looking at mini grid solutions.
All sources, right?
All the different things, and then whatever is left of the grid can still supply the heavy hitters. Embedded generation from various sources to target specific customers. At least if we have the beehive of activities,
right,
and then you have a regulator that's ensuring that there's a level playing field, I think we would largely be on the way to solving the problem. And by the way, I keep saying something. The fact of the privatization has actually democratized knowledge in this area. You wouldn't have been able to speak the way you were speaking so many years ago. None of us would have been able to speak.
Everybody's learning what's happening in the country.
And that's why the knowledge is power. So that's where you begin. So from that point on, we will be solution driven.
Right.
And that's why I said there's a good commercial proposition here.
Right.
We're 200 million people, we're crowded around 5,000 megawatts.
Right.
How do we increase that to to the benefit of everybody.
Thank you very much for that. And as we tie things together, I'm going to have to come to you.
Yeah.
Almost 2 years of this administration, perhaps handling the sector. What's your assessment, summarily, and perhaps projections? What's ahead for the remainder of the 2 years for this term?
Yeah, thank you very much. Basically, we have seen improvement in the sector, improvement in terms of a little bit of liquidity now in the sector based on the tariff that was introduced. Though we've not got what we wanted, we've not got there yet, but I'm sure we'll get there. Secondly, a lot of investment has also come into the sector. You spoke about the World Bank loan, 750 million, and there's also the JICA loan, that's the Japanese International Cooperation Agency loan, all focused on the renewable energy. You know, these are ways of solving some of the problems that we have in order to serve the unserved and the underserved communities in the country. You know, and the Siemens deal is also there. You know, the second phase is going to. The phase one of it is going to start very soon, and that is going to give us about 14 upgrading of 14 substations and about 21 new substations that will be built. You know, so all these are ways of improving the sector and ensuring that we have electricity. And I can tell you that with what we have got now, about 603 megawatts available electricity, generation, I'm sure that this is going to be improved upon with all of these things that have been put in place. You know.
Thank you very much. Bolaji Tunji, the Special Advisor, Communications and Strategy, Minister of Power. We've also had the privilege of having George Etomi, Principal Partner, George Etomi and Partner, and stakeholder of EcoDisco, as well, CEO, Expedite Consulting, former Commissioner, NERC, Consumer Affairs, Market and Competitions Rates, AO, and of course, the former Lagos Commissioner for Energy, Olalere Odushote. It's been great having this, again, power-packed panel right here on the show. Power and the people, accessibility, availability, and affordability. Thank you for sticking with us. Stay with us here on News Central.